evening. My name is Ron Wheeler, and I'm the president of Missoula Community Access Television. I'm also a local high school teacher. I'm going to be your moderator tonight, and I'd like to welcome you, those of you who came out tonight, to The Right to Know, a public forum at the Missoula Public Library. And I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining us via television, MCAT, Channel 22. Our plans were to go out live tonight. I understand there are some technical difficulties, and we may not be cable casting live. We are recording this session, and it will be cable cast in the near future. So if we come on, that's great, and if we don't, you'll see us when you see us. I want to open this session of Banned Books Week by relating just a quick anecdote. I was born in New York City, and I was raised by my grandmother, who was well, in part I was raised by my grandmother. She was a Russian immigrant, came to this country in 1909, I believe it was. And I guess as a youngster, I had a talent for upsetting adults with things that I said, and my grandmother would always defend me, and she would tell me, it's okay, tell them it's a free country, you can say whatever you want, it's a free country. And I guess I always believed that, and as I grew older and learned about the Constitution, I guess she really did know what she was talking about. Well, tonight and this week, we're going to be asking some questions about whether or not this is a free country, who has the right to speak, what is it they have the right to say, and maybe above all, who has the right to listen. Well, tonight we have a distinguished panel, and I'd like to introduce them, and then we'll go around for some short statements, and eventually you people will take over the floor. To my left is Dana Boussard, an NEA grant recipient. To her left, Dr. Jerry Long, professor in the School of Education, University of Montana. Then is Laura Millin, director of the Missoula Museum of the Arts. Then we have Dave Pauli, director of Missoula's Public Library, and Bob Scott, an attorney. I'd like to start tonight's presentations with Dana Boussard.
Thank you, Ron, very much. For those of you that do not know, I'm a visual artist. And for the last year, I've been quite heavily involved with the issues that have surrounded the National Endowment for the Arts. I was a participant, one of 20 people who went to Washington in May to begin to rework a bill that could be acceptable to Congress. That bill that we worked on has been changed and altered, and lots of other people have thrown in bills on top of that. And it's this week and next week that the decisions will be made about the final fate of the endowment. But one thing that I feel that I have learned over the last year, and one thing that I think that I've become more enlightened upon, is the role of the artist. And I mean the artist, not the visual artist alone. The writer, the performer, the media artist, the dancer, whatever kind of artist you may be. Because being an artist is very special. All of us who are artists should feel very lucky that somehow something has happened that has given us somewhat of a gift to be able to work as artists. And when we go in a studio and create art, and I mean real art that is provocative and strong and makes a direct connection with us, and that sometimes is only 2% of the time that we're ever in a studio. When we do that, we move ourselves into some kind of an altered state. We go into the state of complete joy, and that joy is reflected in the work that we produce. That's really wonderful if you really think about it, because in fact that is what is special about civilization. What do we do when we take a trip to Europe? We go to the museums. We look at the art. We get involved very deeply and emotionally when we go sit and listen to a symphony or a ballet, or when we pick up a wonderful book. It moves us, it changes us. This is extremely important and necessary for our civilization to move along. However, there are an awful lot of people out there who don't feel these feelings. They're concerned with an awful lot of other issues, and those issues are important issues too. They're concerned with whether their children are going to get a good education. They're concerned with whether they're going to be raped as they walk down the street at night. They're concerned with ideas of the world getting too crazy and too obscene and things getting out of hand, and what ends up happening is that they become very fearful. And I think that there's some understanding there. I think a lot of us in this room at different times are fearful over what is happening in the world. So you've got those two things going at the same time. And this other group of people over here doesn't seem to understand that 2% of time we want to go in there and have perfect joy and rapture, and that will come out in the great art that we do in the museum. They don't understand that, and it is our place to tell them. Now, it's vitally important, I think, that we as artists have our time of solitude, because that's the only way we're going to ever make art, is to go in, shut the door, and be by ourselves. But something else happens after that is done. And I think many times as artists in recent years, we have forgotten that other part. We've forgotten the part that we need to go back out when that solitude time is done, and when we have an extra hour a week or an hour a month or whatever we want to separate out. We need to go back out into the world and show them that what we are doing is good, is important, and necessary for civilization, and that it's not fearful, that it's not a thing to be afraid of. And that means we have to be political. We have to go out into the world and politic. Now, there are lots of ways we can politic. And I think all of you know that you can pick your own way of doing that. But we must go back out into the world. And I've found out over the last year that an awful lot of artists are not doing that. They're saying, I'm doing my part. I'm going in and shutting the door. I'm doing my little 2% once every month. And that's what's important to me. But we're going to lose it. Things have changed in this world. The rest of the country is not coming along with us. And we've got to go out there and talk to them, work with them, show them in some way that what we do is good, necessary, and important. In order for us to have our private space, we have got to become public. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Dr. Law. Jerry.
Okay. I'm a college professor, and the shortest speech I have is 50 minutes. We've been asked to limit ourselves to about 5 minutes, and my part of this program is to talk about public schools and censorships and censorship efforts. And it's really difficult to talk about public schools in a 5-minute period of time because they're so complex in American society. There's over 13,000 school districts in the United States. We have 50 states and 50 different sets of rules and regulations governing public schools. For this part of the program, I'd like to talk a minute about how public schools have very little in the way of protection, organized pressure groups that try to take books out of a library or get rid of a teacher that's teaching something that they don't like, or using materials or films or film strips that they may not like. How does a public school deal with that issue? What do they have that protects them in cases where people come up and want to protest removing books from a library? During the decade of the 1980s, we have had a tremendous increase in public schools in the number of cases of serious attempts to take something out of a school or keep a teacher from using a particular method that they want to use. There have virtually been many, many surveys done in almost all the states asking teachers and school administrators and school boards Has there been any attempt to remove books from your shelves? In every single survey that I know of during the 1980s, there has been a tremendous increase in the number of attempts at textbook censorship. There are no exceptions to that rule. Everybody indicates large numbers of attempts to censor books. Part of this was brought about in the 1980s by some of the television evangelical movement. Jerry Falwell has his television station and he reaches millions of people. Pat Robinson, Jimmy Swaggart, Jimmy Baker, they have all had programs over and over and over again about getting some of these godless books out of the public school libraries. Not only have public schools been attacked from what you might call the right wing, but they've been attacked also from the left wing. Organizations like the NAACP would like to see Uncle Tom removed from public school libraries because that book portrays blacks in a submissive, negative role. Women's groups that have tried to raise the consciousness of people during the 1970s and the 1980s are also concerned, some organizations are concerned about how women are portrayed in some books, and they want different portrayals, women portrayed in a more positive light, alternatives for women, and they want certain books taken out of the libraries and certain textbooks not used because they don't like the way women are portrayed in those books. Almost every national pressure group that you can think of, like the American Rifle Association, American Manufacturers Association, most of the large labor unions, all have community relations groups, and these groups go in and evaluate textbooks. They want their organization or their theme or whatever they're pushing portrayed in a positive light. Labor unions do not like textbooks that portray labor unions in a negative light, and so they try to get those textbooks removed, or they try to get the publishers to change the way labor unions are portrayed in those books. So public schools get it from both ends of the spectrum, and it's very difficult for them to protect themselves. Schools are governed by school boards. They're very sensitive to community pressure. Administrators can be fired easily by school boards or contracts not renewed. If you have ever followed one of these censorship cases in a newspaper, it gets very, very sticky and very, very difficult because both sides can bring large numbers of people into a school board meeting and try to get their point of view across. So it is a very difficult situation for a school to be in. On the positive side, I would like to say the decade of the 1980s saw several federal district court cases and a few Supreme Court cases. As a generalization, the court cases during the 1980s have given public schools and teachers tremendous leeway, and that's where most of the protection comes from for school officials. In the classic case of the 1980s, Island Trees versus Pico, a school board and a superintendent together, plus a group of parents, wanted to take 9 books out of a library. A group of students protested, and a group of students filed suit against the school board and the superintendent, and the students won that case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that this was an effort on the part of the school board to censor ideas. The books, the 9 books that they tried to remove from the shelf were books like Soul on Ice, Down These Mean Streets, A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, Go Ask Alice. A large number of these books happen to be books about blacks and minorities. The school board did not like the content of the books, and the reason they were censored was because they disagreed with the ideas. And the Supreme Court said students in public schools have the protection of the First Amendment of the Constitution. There are many, many other cases that took part in the 1980s, and generally speaking, almost all of those upheld the rights of schools to have the free flow of information, diversity of views in public schools and public school libraries. And I think that's about my 5 minutes, so I'll stop right here for now, Ron.
Thanks, Terry. Laura?
I come to you tonight as sort of a dispirited warrior from the last year and a half of the NEA battle that Dana touched on. I work in the visual arts primarily and have been active with the fight to save the NEA for a little over a year. And I've really changed my thinking about a lot of issues related to the whole argument. And so I find myself unable to come before a group and kind of do the same old thing, defending freedom of speech and so on, because I think those arguments have started to echo kind of empty. And so I just wanted to throw out some speculations about that. And I'd like to look more and more at the example of books and the fight that is going on within literature, and that has actually gone on, I know, a lot longer than we have had to fight in the visual arts, and that could be part of our problem. I think we're kind of inexperienced at this and a little self-righteous, possibly. But the main point I feel like I can make is that the argument that artists deserve absolute freedom of expression and freedom of speech really bypasses some basic issues, which have to do with community and different points of view and ethnic traditions and the rights of different kinds of peoples and to their religious beliefs and so on. And so I think that we kind of made a mistake in the last year, just so staunchly and repeatedly fighting for those freedoms, just demanding the right to those freedoms, without looking a little bit more closely at the issues that might be involved. And you know, a year ago, I wore just a smattering of the buttons I've collected in my work in the last year tonight. A year ago, I was back in Seattle and went to see an exhibit called Taboo. And this was very much in response to the whole fight to save the NEA and the censorship that was had been legislated by Helms and so on. And I felt that the exhibit really kind of missed the point because they were looking at this taboo issue. Yet now, a year later, I find myself thinking about that again and thinking, you know, it does have a lot to do with taboos. But I don't think we should celebrate our right to cross taboos or express taboo positions or whatever, but that is in fact one of the things that is at issue, is that there are taboos that have been crossed and will be crossed again and a million times maybe, but that we should be able to discuss that. I think we should be able to have discussions in our communities about those issues. You know, I'm not referring to Mapplethorpe when I say this, so don't have that Mapplethorpe image in your mind. I don't mean to be saying that anything specific here in terms of individual artists, but I think we've possibly learned a lesson that we need to open up to community concerns. How different that might have made the whole political argument, I don't know. I'm just speculating. This is ironic because I think actually the decision will be fairly favorable. And I don't mean to say that I don't want the NEA to be reauthorized. I have not changed my mind about that. Another observation I have is that the political process, I started to feel discouraged that the political process was one that we could meaningfully engage in. You know, no matter what we mounted, it didn't seem to really be making that much difference. And maybe it's just kind of a waiting game. This button here is from a campaign in Washington State where an artist who was commissioned to do a mural for the state capitol building was essentially censored 7 years ago. The legislators objected to the work of art. It was covered up. There was a fight mounted, but it kind of died down. The curtain stayed over the artwork for 7 years. It was scheduled to come down, and the fight rose up one more time, and we got them to agree to open the curtains and take a public opinion poll and an opinion poll amongst the legislators one more time. And guess what? You know, everybody changed their minds. They liked the artwork. And now it's a permanent installation. So I think that's the second observation I made, is that the political process is, I think, incredibly compromising to art. John Frohmeyer, who is now representing the National Endowment, has made, I think, severely compromising, politically based decisions. And that was incredibly discouraging to me. So again and again, I guess my focus gets brought back to community. If in the museum that I work a controversy arose, my first response would be to open up a community dialogue about the controversy and see where we could go through that process. And in thinking about that, I remembered a tape I once saw about AIDS. And it was the kind of videotape that just surveyed a couple different communities grappling with AIDS. And this was in the early days when it was first really becoming a widespread problem. And there was a long segment on a community where a boy, an elementary age schoolboy had been refused to attend school. And so, you know, unable to resolve this, they just had a big community meeting, and it went on for 5 hours. And it was just an incredibly passionate battle, back and forth. And in the end, understanding was reached, and he was allowed to come back into school. And they had come to that decision together. So those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the library. I'm Dave Pauli. I'm director here at the Missoula Public Library. We live in a society where there are a number of different value systems operating. That's probably obvious to everyone here, but that's not so obvious to everyone in the country. I mean, we do have people who haven't really come to that realization that there is such a diversity of value systems. One of the responsibilities of a library is to reflect that in the materials that we collect, that we lend out to the public. We wouldn't be doing our job if we only reflected a very narrow points of view, or very few in number. So we try very hard to reflect a diversity of values in our collection. I'd like to speak a little bit about a public library and what happens when material is challenged. Specifically about this library, but also in general. One thing that is a little different from a public school is we don't have any required reading lists at a public library, and of course no required attendance laws. Most of the cases where material has been challenged, the majority of those cases happen in public schools, and as they relate to libraries, school libraries tend to get more of a focus because children are required to read certain kinds of books as a required reading list, something of that nature. So public libraries have less of a problem in that respect. But that's not to say that we have not had and don't continue to have a number of cases. It's an ongoing problem where people do challenge material in a library. And every library, virtually every library, has some kind of procedure worked out to deal with the challenge. My experience is, in dealing with challenges, first of all, most people want to talk to someone about their concern about a book, a videotape, whatever it is they may have borrowed from a library. And the first thing that any library staff member needs to do is adopt a stance of active listening and hear the person. If you immediately get defensive and treat that person as a crackpot who doesn't know what they're talking about and how could they object to this fine piece of literature, you're likely to escalate matters. And I really truly believe that if you listen and you try to understand why a person has an objection, it really almost virtually 100% of challenges can be handled at that first informal contact, because many people do just want to share their concern. We have a procedure that does, of course, go beyond that if necessary. If someone has a challenge and they are not satisfied with talking with a library staff member about their concern, the next step is they come to the director, to me, and I will discuss matters with them. If they would like, I will respond in writing. I will read the book, view the videotape or whatever, and give my response, which of course generally is that we selected this piece of material, and I would give the reasons why we felt it was appropriate to select it, and therefore we feel it should be available to people in the community who want to read, view, whatever. Generally, my response is, of course, to defend the principles of intellectual freedom and to resist any attempts at censorship. Again, I think it depends very much on how you treat that individual in response, either verbally or in writing. If you adopt a condescending attitude, the person is going to get defensive and be offended. And I view responding to complaints as a service, just like any other service that we do in the library. It's part of my job. I don't feel that it's an infringement upon me if someone wants to complain about a book or anything else that they found in the library. I view it as just part of the work I have to do. And I'm very happy to talk with people who want to share their concerns with me about things that they have read or viewed. Most of the complaints that we get in public libraries come not from individuals who have, say, read a particular book that they checked out of the library that they objected to for their own personal taking of offense. Rather, it is people who object to the book because it's something their children have read or had access to, and they object to the ideas or the language or whatever. Or the other thing is people object to it being in the library because other people who read this might somehow be damaged by it. But most people do not necessarily see that they could be harmed or damaged by whatever the material is. They're sharing their concern for somebody else. In the case of sharing your concern for your children, I think that's a perfectly legitimate concern. And I'm very happy when parents take enough time to be concerned about and to look at the things that their children are reading and to want to give them some guidance. And I feel that that is part of our job at the library, too, is to give especially children guidance when they ask us for guidance. We can bring them appropriate material for their age level, for their interest level, and we need an ongoing dialogue with kids. Obviously, we check out almost 500,000 items a year at this library. We can't possibly have that dialogue with every child who comes in or every reader, and people, kids and adults don't often ask us, but when they do, I think that's part of our responsibility to help kids find, help anybody find appropriate reading material. I think that's the end of mine.
Thank you, David. I've just been notified that we are, at this point, going out live to Missoula. And again, I'd like to welcome those of you who've tuned in MCAT and missed the first half hour. You'll get to see it on our rebroadcast. We're presently involved in some short statements by panel members, and we will then go to our audience for questions or statements. Our next panelist is Bob Scott. Bob, you're on.
Thank you. I'm Bob Scott. I am a member of the ACLU. I am also an attorney here in Missoula, and I have also lobbied at the legislature in Helena in 1987 and 1989. I am here today to speak about the legislative perspective regarding your First Amendment rights, or I suppose you could term it what you can do about the problem of censorship, which many times is promulgated by citizens with good intention, but to some extent citizens which are blinded by their own purpose. The main observation that I'd like to make is that I found that many bills that had been introduced to the legislature will pass simply because there's no public knowledge that they exist, and there's no public participation at the legislative level. The ACLU acts when it can. We're unfortunately grossly underfunded like everybody else, but we act as a watchdog when we can to identify and oppose bills which threaten civil liberties. And of course, the First Amendment, your First Amendment rights are paramount. So there is a certain amount of watchdogging or observation that's going on, but one problem is that many people, many citizens I have found simply do not realize what's happening in Helena, largely because it isn't carried in the newspapers. It isn't carried on the radio. It isn't carried on television. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 to 1,500 bills introduced each session. There's a lot of bills to sort through. It's a difficult problem to keep an eye on it, but it's something that is absolutely critical, and I would urge that this be kept in mind by everyone that's concerned about your First Amendment freedoms. The climate in the past years up there has been one of fear, and at the legislative level, the fear is fear of the voting public. And it's not even so much the fear of the voting public as a fear of their perception of what the voting public is interested in, or what the voting public wants, or what the voting public would find offensive. So in that climate, and this has been particularly true in the last couple of sessions, many groups will attempt to exploit these fears, the fears of the legislature, through bootstrapping other fears that one would perceive from the national news and so forth up to the legislative level. And let me explain what I mean by that. The appearance at the legislature by a large number of people at a committee hearing where these bills are debated, or at least there's presentations made on them, the appearance of a large number of people there on one side, not counterbalanced by an equally large number of people on the other side, makes a tremendous impression on the legislators. If they perceive that this legislation that's been introduced is strongly supported, and that there's a great deal of public support for it, even though there might only be 50 or 60 people actually at the hearing, they will be afraid of what voting any other way than what has been asked them by this group of people will do to their chances for re-election. Particularly important, I think, is the perspective of a person that is in the legislature trying to determine, one of the legislators trying to determine how, in fact, he can vote and stay in office and continue to make law that he thinks is good, and yet, on the other hand, he can't always vote his conscience. And there's a little balancing act that seems to go on there. All I can say is that hysteria is not a good basis for making law, and that, therefore, one has to work to introduce balance up there. I'll give you a real quick example. In 1989, an out-of-state group called Citizens for Decency Through Law, out-of-state origin, established a Montana chapter in Libby. They got a senator from the Bozeman area to introduce several bills. They're very, very broadly worded bills. Extremely broad language, which, if taken literally, would essentially suppress all sexual expression, depending upon, I'm just speaking of even the mention of it. I don't have time to read these bills to you. I'd like to, but we'll pass that up. Already, these laws were ostensibly put forth to protect the children. And they used tactics of hysteria. They played tapes of Ted Bundy. Now, you know, I don't know what you think of his credibility, but I certainly don't give too much credence to a man on death row that's trying to desperately get off death row. But they used these tapes. They used some of the most incredibly vile child exploitation material in an attempt to show that these extremely sweeping bills were necessary to protect our children. And this sort of generated this momentum, this hysteria up there. Well, I call it hysteria, which could potentially have caused these bills to go through. And at the first hearing on them, the Senate hearing, there was virtually no opposition. No one could give the legislators a reason to vote against these bills. They saw the Ted Bundy tapes. They saw some extremely radical exploitation stuff. The hysteria, the tension was thick in the hearing room. No one gave them a reason to vote against it. So it passed. It was given a due pass, all three of these bills, and they passed 49-1 in the Senate. By the time of the House hearing, however, many people had come forward, librarians. They'd seen some of the press on this, bookstore owners, video store people, major theaters, authors, mental health people, even some blue-haired ladies. We had an equal number of people there, and it gave the legislators some solid ground to vote against these bills. And two of them were killed, and one of them was modified to be essentially the same as existing law. I might add that Montana already has laws protecting minors from graphic material. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that it's extremely important to be involved, and you can be involved in this thing, even if you're not in Helena. And the first thing you've got to remember is ask the people that are running what their position is on the Bill of Rights, specifically here, the First Amendment. Find out, and then elect the people that will protect it. Secondly, keep track of the legislature. You can call up there, find out about these bills. They're all introduced in January, so pretty much everything is in the hopper by the end of January. And you can find out what exactly is going on up there. Organize opposition early for the hearings. If you're in a group of people that are concerned about this, you can organize opposition early and be ready for it. And fourth, and most important for most people, is, believe me, writing letters, calling your legislator, or any of them on the phone makes a big difference, in Montana at least. I can't speak for other states, and I can't speak for the United States Congress, but it makes an incredible amount of difference when those little messages start piling up on their desks. And I'm sure I've overrun my 5 minutes, but there is something that can be done to stop the excesses which sometimes are put forth by otherwise well-meaning people. I think for the most part they are, but these excesses, by definition, I suppose, would be very dangerous to everyone's right to read and speak as they wish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Again, I'd like to welcome those of you who may just be joining us on MCAT. Due to some technical difficulties, we got on the air a little late. We will be rebroadcasting this program in its entirety sometime soon. We're going to move on to the next part of our presentation, which involves the audience. We'd like to open our microphone at this point. You should know that the microphone that's at the podium is plugged into our cable cast and is not amplified in the room. So I'd like you to speak loudly if you would. I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself. You certainly don't have to. And you're welcome to make statements or ask questions of the panelists. there anyone who would like to come to the microphone? Well, then it's my job. I get to ask a question. I'd like to kind of open this up again, sort of anecdotally. I've been thinking about this for a long time, obviously, and almost always my thoughts dwell on opening up ideas, giving us more access to art, to literature. And it occurred to me that in the past I have been involved on the other side of the coin, and I'd kind of like to bounce this off some of you on the panel. I went to undergraduate school at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and in the zoology department there, in the basement, there was a very large mural. Maybe some of you graphic artists or art directors can address this. It was done in the 1930s, and it was done, I suppose, quite lovingly by an artist in residence commemorating the death of a very popular black janitor. And it was a mural entitled A Darky's Dream of Heaven, and showed this black janitor in the clouds eating watermelon and fried chicken. I and others objected, and eventually we had it covered up in a very temporary fashion with portable shelving. As far as I know, the painting's still on the wall. But how odd to suddenly remember that I've been on the other side of the fence. What do you do in a case like that?
Well, that's part of what I was referring to. I think we have to have the flexibility of responding to changing perceptions, changing demographics. Our communities, our country is really changing. And so we have to be able to respond. I think that's an excellent example of, responding to a change of a sense of history, of a sense of, respect for our, fellow mankind. I mean, I think that's a totally appropriate example of where, and I don't think we have to call it censorship in this case. I mean, I think it's a necessary rethinking that has to be able to occur. I think there has to be able to, I think public art is mixed up in this same mess. Once a public artwork is placed in a community, is it open to question by that community? There was a big, huge debate that just tore the art world in two over a sculpture by a man named Richard Serra that dissected a mall, is that what you call, in front of a major building in New York City. You have a cement mall and steps out in front of the building, and this piece just dissected the whole space. And it was tall. You couldn't see over it. You had to walk around the whole thing to get into the building. Eventually, the employees really objected to the sculpture. It was very oppressive for them walking in and out of the building. And eventually they said, we want this thing out of here. And there was a horrible battle, and eventually it was removed. It really divided everyone. Did they have the right to say no to this artwork? Luckily, somebody else wanted it, and it was placed somewhere else, so it didn't have to be, melted down or something. But my feeling is that we need to be open to that. We need to be open to different points of view. There's a question in the back of the room.
Yes.
Are we allowed to respond as this goes on?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would like you to use the microphone, however. Yes, response, statements, questions, it's all appropriate here.
Hi, my name is Madeline Mercedes, and I'm an artist and a teacher and a community member. And what this strikes in me, Laura, is another instance of community that was purchasing artwork to put outside. And the community in general, this was in Pennsylvania in the area of Allentown. They would put up these public works that had been commissioned and accepted by a panel of people in the community who were somewhat educated about art, we might say. Okay, they were involved in the art world and they knew what was going on in the art world. And so they were getting placed along the commuter line. And a lot of the people who lived in the town, it's basically kind of a two-tone town. It's got a very upper crust side and then it's got a very blue-collar side. And the more blue-collar people with the lower education, not that it's their fault, but that's the way that it was, made objections about these pieces. And I don't think it's been resolved. I think that a lot of times the pieces stay up and the people in the community don't know what kind of power they might have. But to me, it comes to an issue of education, once again. The people that were working around the Richard Serra didn't necessarily have an appreciation of that art, first off, aside from the issue of whether they had to walk around it. If they had an appreciation of it, perhaps walking around it wouldn't have been an imposition. You know, and I think that that is an educational issue and a real important thing to remember when we talk about community talking. That's my point. Thank you.
I think it's a good point. I would just say one thing to it, and that is I think eventually the pool of artists needs to be more diverse, and then the artwork itself will be possibly more diverse and speak to a more diverse audience, and therefore audience could be a little bit more tolerant of works they don't understand if there's some works that they do relate to in the same commission. So I agree with you, though. Education is very important. But I'm just beginning to feel that the art world has narrowed itself too much, both in, you know, on both ends, essentially.
I'd like to interject something here.
Do please.
It occurs to me that one of the fundamental principles that I think I would subscribe to, at any rate, would be that the answer to the type of and art is a form of speech. I'm going to refer to speech. When I say speech, I'm speaking of it in the broadest sense, and it's one of the most fundamental principles, I think, that the answer to speech is more speech. And I think that perhaps that was the lady that just spoke. Perhaps that might be what she was trying to say, and perhaps that might be what your response was. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
you know, if you have
Both saying that.
if you have something that for some reason is offensive to somebody, and this offense in their mind becomes something dangerous, and I think that's what what's really at the ground of it here. I mean, most people, I don't think, would probably be willing to ban something merely because it's offensive to them, but they think there's a danger that underlies it somehow. And I would say to that the answer to that is education, i.e. more speech, more artworks, or speech about the artwork, or a lively dialogue about whatever it is. And it's not going to be lively unless there's some emotion, some spark in it. So, you know, I would say that, you know, from my perspective, a person's, and going back to the original example that was given by the moderator, that it wasn't, I don't think it would be appropriate to cover that artwork up. I think it would be appropriate to make it a topic, an educational topic. This is how it was in the 30s, you know. This is, you know, thank God it's different than that now. I don't know exactly how you approach it, but to just cover it up and brush it under the rug or whatever doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem like that really solves the problem. Rather, just let's you know, hash it out and go on from there.
I have two personal experiences that I can speak to. I have worked in public art for the last 15 years, and I put pieces up all over the country in all kinds of places that are places that people may not normally go to view art. I've had pieces in airports. I've had pieces in jails. I've had pieces in hospitals. I've had them all over. And I've had a couple instances, mostly, for the most part, with the exception of 2, I've had really good response. People have always liked what's happened, and they've liked the panel's decision that my piece go in. But I had an interesting experience once when I put up a piece in Boise, Idaho. I received a very large commission there to do a wall that was 10 feet high and 60 feet long in the city council chambers. And I was very excited about it. The panel that chose my piece was very excited about it. Some of the city council people were excited about it, but there were a few that weren't. And from the time that I received the commission to the time that I completed the commission, 6 or 8 months, whatever was ensuing, a lot of things happened in the town where they begin to think of this revenue sharing money really should go to fix the sewers and shouldn't be going to buy superfluous artwork that's going to hang in the back of the room. And I had every intention of coming over and installing the piece, being put on television, of course, being put on radio, having wonderful receptions hosted, and have everyone say how wonderful it was. And I had my talk and my speech and my slides and all those kinds of things ready to go. Well, by the time I was ready to come, the city council chamber members and the mayor and everyone else in the building had reached such a high level of anxiety over it, and they'd received enough press from the public that they were in such a state of fear that they couldn't bear the thought of this happening. And my schedule was to come over Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and install the piece, and then Monday night be part of the city council meeting and talk about it. When I arrived Thursday, everyone had gone on vacation. The whole building left, with the exception of secretaries, who of course are the ones that were running everything, and they had to stay. So I spent the 4 days there, and I kept talking to the director of the Boise Art Museum, who was sort of in charge of being the liaison person. I said, Rick, where's everybody? Where are those TV cameras? When are we going to have the party? Because I was very excited about the piece. And he, the sweat pouring down the sides of his neck, said, oh, we've got some problems here. So we've got some really big problems. So as it turns out, I was not able to, because of a hysterical fear that happened before anyone ever saw anything, to be able to share any dialogue about the piece. So I had to put the piece up, get back in my truck, and drive home. Nobody knew anything. I never talked to one person. And Rick and I discussed this, and we said, this can't be. This is not going to work. This is not a way to do art. So we began to try to find out where the mayor and the city council people went on their vacation and try to have a dialogue with these people and try to set something up, and so on and so forth, and talk to them about how we needed to make this thing work. Luckily, the secretaries who were there liked it. So they started saying, hey, when the mayor came back, they said, this is not so bad. I think we could live with something like this. And so over a period of time, we made a dialogue happen so that I could come back. And I came back and I did a one-person show of all my other work at the Boise Art Museum. A month later, I printed a brochure statement that the mayor signed that talked about who I was, why I did the artwork, what the artwork meant. It was an extremely symbolic piece. It was a piece very symbolic of the whole city council and the diversity of peoples that would come together in one place. And I spoke to that. And we got public television to come in. And because they finally came in, then the regular television stations decided they wanted to get in on the deal. And I did very well selling in my show, and everyone was thrilled. And the piece has been there for 15 years, and everyone's happy, and I get lots of good reports on it. But I have to go along with all this. It all means that we have to be part of the process. It is important for the artist not just to, as I said before, stay in the studio and work, but to get out there, move out there with people and have a dialogue. Because it is this dialogue and education that's the only way anything is going to happen. Then people have no fear. And when people have no fear and have some understanding, we can all work together.
I wonder if there are different standards for for lack of better terms, what I'd call public versus private art. Public art being that art that is installed in public places and is viewed by people whether or not they choose to view it, whereas literature or television programming, films, the drama, all seem to me to be a bit more private and selected by those individuals. Are there different standards for acceptance by the public here? Are we talking about different things?
I think there are lots of different standards depending on who wants the piece. I mean, if you're buying a piece, you've got a standard by which you're willing to accept it. The artist has to take that and do what they want with it. I mean, they have to decide if they'll live within that standard, if that standard meets the kind of way that they work, whatever. But the standards do change, very rightly so. The Sarah piece is a perfect example of that. I spent a lot of time with that piece when I went to New York. And I saw that, and any of you who have ever been to New York know this, there's no space in New York. There's no place to look anywhere. People are desperate. They've got somebody standing this far away from them, and if they're lucky, they can go to one of those little tiny corner garden spots and have a cup of coffee and see something actually green. And in this space, which was downtown by the courthouse area and so on, there was a huge sort of plaza, one of the biggest ones in the whole city. And I think it made all those people feel really great, that they could actually walk out and walk almost 2 blocks without hitting something to get to the other side, and people would sit out there and have lunch and so on. And I can understand how they felt, because that piece was very intrusive. It was, as Laura said, an extremely tall piece, and it was a piece of black swinging metal. It was a beautiful piece of art. But maybe it wasn't appropriate for that space. And I'm not sure Richard Serra looked at that. And I'm not sure he cared.
Right.
I don't know that. But, you know, I would have a question mark about that, too.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is that no one, I think, in Missoula, well, perhaps I'm wrong, but very few people in Missoula would object to a copy of Mein Kampf in the public library. But I think there would be a great hue and cry if we installed a bust of Adolf Hitler in a prominent place on Higgins Avenue. And I think, therefore, there must be a different standard involved. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there isn't. Maybe the bust would be appropriate. I don't think so.
I think you are wrong in saying that no one would object to a copy of Mein Kampf. Someone
Is there
probably
one?
will.
Is there one?
Yes, I'll go out on
Okay.
a limb and say yes,
All
we
right.
probably do have it. I'm not sure, but if we don't, we should. But I think you're right. In one sense, that is, again, as I said, that's a choice that people can make, and as you pointed out, a choice people can make whether they want to read that or not.
Some people don't have a choice, you know, with the other. If the bust is right down Higgins and they have to go by there every single day, that's a different kind of thing, too. I was on the committee, the Public Art Committee here in Missoula, that picked the 3 X's that are down by the Northern Pacific.
You don't want to give your phone number
that
on
piece.
television, though.
I like that piece. I think it's very good. But we got a call from somebody who was a World War II veteran, who said that piece reminded him of being on the shores of Normandy, and he was having nightmares and couldn't take it anymore. So there are all kinds of things, but I think that it is incumbent upon an artist to somewhat think about those things. They don't necessarily have to do anything about it, but they have to think about it. And they have to think about what's going to happen when their piece is viewed. They can go ahead and choose to do whatever way they want to go with it. That's their choice, but they do have to think about it. And I think public art, an artist has to think a little bit more.
Yeah.
I find that I feel that I have a very great responsibility if I'm putting in a piece where there are 14 of them going down the Anchorage International Airport, and they're going to be there for the next 35 years. I have a responsibility to do something that I can live with, that I feel is appropriate for my own sensibilities, but that is not going to make people offended.
Yes, question? Sure. Would you use the microphone, please?
I'm Angela Helvey, and I work in a local bookstore. I'm a buyer, and I'm just going to make a comment about presentation. I was making a choice on buying a book to buy or not to buy, and it was a book on feminism and pornography. That's the way it came across as being of that subject matter, and I thought, well, that would be interesting. And the rep said, no, you don't want that book. So I said, why? And he says, well, it's really not on feminism and pornography. And he says, it's basically more graphic than what you're thinking. So I found out that someone else in my store had already ordered it. So it came in and I took a look at it, and I found that the way it was presented was just really not appropriate. And so it was basically, you know, we decided to censor it and not put it out on the shelves. But I think if it had been presented in a different way, you know, it would have been readable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, just picking up the book, you think, oh, what is this? It's, you know, it just didn't look like it was supposed to be in that, you know, same subject matter that you're, that was appropriate for that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the audience?
That's an interesting comment. And I was a bookseller in Seattle for several years, and a good friend of ours published a book on that subject. I'm curious as to whether it was the same book.
Yes.
And we then, of course, carried it. This book was called Caught Looking. And,
That's it. That's it. There you
and we had great long debates with this good friend of ours as to whether she should publish this book. And we lost, and she did. And so then we had faced the question of whether we were going to carry it in our bookstore. So we did, and kind of reluctantly. And we were in a location in downtown Seattle, north of the market in the Denny Regrade, where there's a lot of people living on the streets. There's the most diverse downtown population living there. And it just attracted men, like with big trench coats and stuff, like flies, right off the street. They didn't, you know, seriously, it was a very interesting thing, because there's only been a couple of books, and this happened with a few other art books that we had over the years, that, you know, were supposedly going into that taboo area and exploring it artistically. And, you know, it's just interesting to lay a book like that out on the table and see who comes. And it was fascinating. We felt very threatened by what it attracted off the street, and we pulled it from the shelves. So we made the right decision. But, you know, it's touchy. But there was a case where we really had kind of a test case. And there's one thing I'd like to say about this, so that I'm not misunderstood in my new position of being critical, my new honesty. You know, I think that one of the most unfortunate things, for instance, in this NEA debate, is that the fact that it's been kept to the issues of freedom of expression and freedom of speech has kept us from identifying our adversaries as who they really are. And it's kept us from a discussion of whether religious preferences and dogma should decide what we get to see, what we get to read, and so on. You know, this debate in the art world has not entered one bit into that realm. As if we stray one foot into controversial issues, we'll lose ground or something. I don't know. I'm just starting to explore this now myself, but I think that that's another example of the unfortunate nature of a real staunch, we have the right to say whatever we need to say kind of position. It basically shields our adversaries from being revealed for, you know, the reactionary sorts that they are.
I have I have a little different view. Putting on my MCAT hat as president of the board, anything that Anytime a bookseller decides to carry a book or not to carry a book, that bookseller is acting as a First Amendment speaker and has the perfect right to do that. Someone who runs a theater and decides on what movies they show and what movies they don't show, again, is acting as a First Amendment speaker. On the other hand, there are common carriers, in legal terms, who simply provide a conduit for First Amendment speech. And I personally like to view MCAT, Community Access Television, as such a common carrier. So anyone who can't have their book sold in town or their artwork posted in a gallery will be free to come to MCAT. It's certainly going to be there. Now, what that means is that MCAT is a conduit for First Amendment speech, but does not represent itself as a First Amendment speaker. So we accept virtually everything so long as it is allowed by the First Amendment specifically, which covers most everything. The upshot of this is that we understand that we're going to get a lot of static for this. It's not going to be our responsibility, and that will be what we say to the public if the public tells us, well, you shouldn't have put that on. Well, we'll hopefully give them the name of the producer and let them call them. Because as a First Amendment speaker, we think that not only does an individual have the right to express themselves through the First Amendment, but they also have the obligation to listen to the criticism. It's almost impossible to escape. And so when we say, when Bob talks about more speech, I think maybe that's one of the things that he's talking about. Anyone who uses the First Amendment, and everyone should, also ought to expect others to use the First Amendment to criticize ideas they don't like. But no one can say you can't do it, either way. So expect lots of controversy on MCAT. You people are the ones who are going to put it there.
I'd like to extend that a little bit to the public schools. It's not as easy as you're taking a stand and saying that you'll put anything on television. In public schools, you know, with children, they have to be there by force of law. All 50 states have compulsory attendance laws. Some children in public schools are highly impressionable. There have been a couple of recent court cases where a teacher had a particular point of view, wanted to teach creation science in a science class. Do you think that you would have this same view with children in public school? Should that teacher be allowed? The teacher claimed that the school system not allowing him to do that violated his right of academic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, should that teacher be allowed to teach scientific creationism in a biology class?
Why did I know you were going to ask this, Jerry? I don't have an answer for you. However, I can tell you that again, we're dealing with a public system rather than that private system, and so I think it does need to be more constrained. I can speak to you as a biologist and tell you that creationism may have a place in school, but it's not in a biology class. And so I don't think that this teacher had a gripe. But creationism, I suppose, has a place in public school.
That's what the school board said, and that's what the court said. He did not have a gripe.
I was aware of that, Jerry.
Cannot cross the lines.
I'd like to just add one comment. What you have with that particular issue is a collision of two prongs of the First Amendment, one being freedom of speech and the prong of separation of church and state, and that the decision which ultimately came down on it on the side of preventing creationism from being taught as a biological theory or whatever, ultimately, I think, probably weighed the separation of church and state heavier than it did the freedom of speech prong. So there is a balancing that goes on in the constitutional decisions that the courts make. And it's interesting because those two come out of the very same amendment to the Constitution.
I was talking about another case, a case of an individual that wanted to do that. There was a case, Aguilera versus Edwards in Louisiana. The state of Louisiana passed a law saying that if you taught evolution, you must teach creation science. And that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, that's unconstitutional law. It was so unconstitutional, it was unconstitutional on its face. They didn't have the jury trial or anything. It was unconstitutional, period.
Yes.
Ms. Broussard, you were saying earlier that you went to Washington, D.C. to work on a new bill for the National Endowment for the Arts.
Yes.
I was wondering why you decided to go and work for a new bill instead of defending the old one.
The old, because we were actually going there at the request of Representative Pat Williams. And Pat Williams told us without question the old one would not make it. The old one being the way that the National Endowment has been set up for the last 25 years under the guidelines and amendments. And it's a perfectly wonderful bill, the way it's been working for 25 years. And with the exception of this immediate last year or two controversy, has worked perfectly well. And we would have wanted to defend it. We felt that it was the best. However, we were told that there was absolutely no way we were going to get away with that, and that there needed to be some concessions made. And so that's what we were there for, were to work on some concessions. It was very interesting, even within the arts community, that all the major arts organizations were representative, the director of the American Association of Art Museums, etc. And there was one artist representative, myself, one musician representative, and that was Billy Taylor from Washington, D.C., and two community members, one being someone who had been on the Cincinnati board and was very aware of the problems in Cincinnati, and another one, a minister from Washington, D.C. The rest were all officials and directors and so on of organizations. And within that group, there was an extreme diversity right there. It was very interesting to see that what we wanted to do was to come to consensus, because first and foremost, we felt that if the arts groups of this country were not together, if we could not stand up together and make one statement, it was gone, no matter what it was. So we decided we needed to come to consensus. So we started at 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday morning, and we would work till 3 in the morning. Then we'd start again at 8 o'clock and work till 3. We spent all of our meals having pizza and Chinese food delivered into the tables. By the end of the week, the whole room was a total disaster. But we felt that we came to a consensus. But it was amazing to see how the different arts groups would react, and the concessions that some groups were willing to make, and the concessions that other groups were absolutely not willing to make under any kind of way.
What were some of those concessions? And
one of them was that if one of the very left area groups was not even wanting to address the situation of if the work is deemed obscene and found obscene locally, then it would be taken to the courts, and the courts finally would make the decision. That took 3 days for some people to get to that point that they would even allow that to be set down on paper, because they felt that it wasn't even an appropriate issue to bring up. Finally, that got set down on paper. Another point that had a lot of diversity to it was if, in fact, in a local situation, your work is found to be objectionable, it's taken to the court, and then the court finds that, in fact, it is obscene, what's the decision after that? Some people were in favor of conceding and saying, okay, my work has been found objectionable, or the work of an artist has been found objectionable, it's gone to the courts have said that it's objectionable and found obscene according to law. Therefore, the National Endowment should at that point appropriately make the artist pay back the money that they got for the grant, and say have a 3-year suspension, a 5-year suspension, whatever, before they would be allowed to apply for another grant. That never even could come to the table. I mean, we got it to the table, but there was never a consensus on that issue. Now I believe that new amendments to this have been brought up, in the Senate, and I think that probably that may go through.
That
as
exact measure has
Yeah,
been proposed by
right.
Kennedy and Hatch.
And that may be what ends up being agreed on. I myself had no problems with that. I had no objection to if, in fact, it goes all the way there, then your hands do get slapped. But there were groups that weren't going to go with it at all. And so the concessions that we made in the bill that we put forth was one that had a lot of educational restriction kinds of things to it. It asked for more education in NEA appropriations, and I think that was good, because I think many times nobody knows that the NEA was behind anything. Lots of wonderful things are out here. There are things in schools over this town that people do not know that it's been NEA money that has finally trickled down to provide those services for kids. Puppeteers and little performance things and dancing things and all kinds of things that are very wonderful for children and certainly mild and in no way have any kind of sense of objection to that. And I think the NEA was remiss over its lifetime in letting everybody know how really involved they were in these kinds of things. I mean, I think that there are people in this town, and I think Missoula is a town who's very interested in the arts, much more than a lot of towns in this state. I mean, we all know that Missoula is a pretty artistic town compared to lots of them. And there are people here who have no concept that ASUM programming has some trickle down from the NEA. That, I mean, you can name 30, 40 things here. People think, oh, it's the ASUM, it's money from the university, comes from somewhere, but we don't know where. But they don't have a concept that it's the NEA. The NEA has done incredibly wonderful things, but I think it has been remiss a little bit in letting people know how important it is. Because if more people knew how important it was, then more people would be out there standing up saying we've got to keep it, and we've got to keep it the way it is, even though there are people out on the other edge doing things. Because it's important for people to be out on the other edge too. But most of those people who are out on the other edge are not really in rural America. They're mostly in cities. And for the most part, most people in cities are more tolerant of that kind of thing. But somehow people in rural America have heard that somebody in the kitchen in New York was doing something hysterical, and they're afraid that they're going to come out here in the hallway and there'll be somebody doing that. So they have a very kind of thwarted effort of, a perception of knowing what's objectionable, what's not, what's going to happen to them, and what fears to be able to deal with. Artists have, again, I have to say, artists have got to get out there and talk to people about this. And I found also over the last year that most artists are not doing it. It's a small core of people who are out there being political. I made lots and lots of phone calls to lots and lots of people and said, we've got to do this, 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 and this. Nobody called me back. Laura and I have, along with a handful of people in this town, and we have to say this town's more artistic and more inclined to want to do these things than anybody else. In this town, not that many people have been out there jumping around and stomping. For themselves. For themselves, there have been people here who are writers, who are musicians, who are whatever, who don't have any concept of what they're going to lose. They just say, well, gee, I'm sorry, I signed my name on that letter, and that's as far as I'm going to go. And that's very discouraging. It's discouraging because you certainly can't expect Joe Blow out there in the middle of the road who never goes to look at art and only watches football games to care about what happens to the National Endowment. They don't care. They don't even know what it is. In fact, the minister that was on the committee from Washington, D.C., who is a fabulous person, I mean, wonderful guy. He really is sharp and for women's rights and really a liberal person, said he had lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, and he didn't have really a handle on what the National Endowment did. Now, we're all wrong for that. The endowment's wrong, the artists are wrong for not being more vocal and being out there. Not screaming, we get to do whatever we want to whenever we want to, and you better not tell us not to do it. But for speaking in a very positive and educational way about how important art is to all of our lives.
Okay, one more question.
Okay.
You also talked about a 2% of art being sort of the true core of real art that's out there. And
No, well, that's not exactly what I said.
that's
Okay.
okay. That's the way
I
it came
said
across. I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Okay, I was speaking, I was speaking for myself, and I think I'm speaking for an awful lot of other artists. I go out in the studio every day, and I work 8 hours a day, and probably 2% of the time that I'm out there, I actually make a connection. I actually really do it, and that whole thing starts to really work. It doesn't mean the other work is not important and it's necessary. It's important and necessary for us all to do. I mean, we have to type at the typewriter for 10 years before we finally get the one little poem that's the right poem. But that's what we need. We're searching for. All of us, in whatever way we live, whatever we do, I mean, whether you want to say artist or non-artist person, is looking for that one little moment where it all clicks. Everything in your life clicks, everything in your head clicks, and it all works. And it's super important that we look for that, and it's super important we want that, and it's super important that when we get it, we let that out. That's what life is. I mean, that's what it's all about. The rest of it's just washing dishes and taking care of making beds. Does that explain it a little bit better? Thank you.
Just an interjection. We may be a little parochial out here in Montana, but let me tell you, I just visited Pat Williams' office and talked to all of his staff, and they have never worked so hard or taken so much static as they have on the National Endowment for the Arts defense. And Pat Williams is doing the job, and he's taking a lot of heat for us back here in Montana and for people all over the country. And whether you like them or you don't like them, this is yo person service that he's doing on this one.
He's doing a fabulous job. I mean, and the point is, they wouldn't have to work nearly so hard if we were doing what we were supposed to be doing out here.
Yeah, I hear you.
They're out there begging us to write letters. Ann Hausman is working night and day out there. And most of their mail that was coming in was negative. People who are on the side saying, hey, we don't want any of this, they're out there working lots harder than we are.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a comment. Primarily when I'm faced with something new is when I notice this. Like listening to KUFM and Alien Radio. This happens occasionally. Or the first time I heard rap. I notice I go through a certain development within myself when I'm faced with something new. And the first thing that happens is I don't understand. And I can't understand the vocabulary, get a little lost in the rhythm of the language. It's like listening to a child, the first time a child talks to you, a child you don't know. Their language use is so fresh that it's hard to plug in. You have to listen to it for a few moments. And then the second thing that happens is whatever my prevailing mind is, my emotional set, is what I start hearing in the stuff. And I hate to admit it, but often this is fear. And so the first reaction I get is, what are they talking about? What kind of trip is being laid on me here? And I've lived long enough that I outgrow that, and what happens third is I pay attention. And part of what an artist does, I think, is re-perceive or re-express the reality, our everyday. And if there are people who are just raving geniuses right off the block. They function primarily on inspiration, and those people, you can't tell what's going to come out. But most artists, I think, get where they get because of discipline. And usually, by the time you exercise enough discipline, I think you come to a place where you this is an argument I carry on with myself all the time. Is it a moral universe or not? Is there some kind of values for something? I argue with myself about things all the time, but it comes down finally to justice. A child wants justice immediately, and they know what it is immediately. It seemed like to me an argument for a moral universe. And so, as a third step to listening to something that's new, if any kind of work has gone into it all, you usually come down to some moral sense. Somebody has actually taught or actually learned something. So censorship is very difficult, and I wish I could say, yeah, that can go, that can stay, and actually have an argument for things. So the artist, I think, does that, reperceive reality, teach it to us in a new way, and then I think the second thing they do is kind of establish a reality possible for dreams, for achievement of the dreams that possess most people, I think. Whether the artist is a street musician or a visual artist or a writer or living a life of quality of a particular type, the artist is someone who actually pushes through and accomplishes it to some degree, enough that people who are perceiving say, hey, it's possible for me to achieve a dream also. Whether that achievement of the dream for the artist becomes their destiny or not, the very fact that you're out there pushing for it. And so what I'm coming to is kind of what Laura was talking about, who objects to the art. And all the lines, at least the way my thinking has been going, point toward the more authoritarian your mind or the government, the culture you're living in, is, the more censorship you're going to see. Because the more dreams you have and the more dreams you fulfill, the more language there is available to people to state their own thinking in, to give coherence to the mental state. I'm starting to think about what a leftist is, and the more I think about it, the less I know. Revolutionaries and reactionaries on the two different hands. I think the more art you have, the more revolution you have. The more serious thinking you do, the more power is in the art, and the power is pretty much revolutionary. Revolution, it causes change. And so I think the enemy is someone who doesn't want us to be able to articulate what we're trying to get at. There's a lot of, well, there's not a lot. There's some art that's obviously in bad taste. What's it worth? It's usually so easy and so cheap that it doesn't take much of your time. The art that was really powerful is the stuff that says, whoa, you know, that puts me through all three of my stages, you know. I don't understand it, I'm afraid of it, and then I start saying, what is this about? So I wish I had a question to end this with, because it'd be a nice way for me to get out of this. But, but thank you for permitting me to make that comment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I don't have a specific question either. My name is Delia Hagan, and I'm a senior at Hellgate High School. I just want to hear the views of the panel on a controversy that's going on at our school. In the school paper, the editorial cartoonist has been putting a swastika in each of his editorial cartoons. And that's offensive to many students at Hellgate. And it is, and you guys were talking about Hitler in public schools, so I'd like to hear your views on it.
Who wants to jump in?
I'd like to ask you, just for clarification, you say he puts it in the cartoon. Does he sign with it, or I mean, in what way is it in the cartoon?
It's in it in many different ways. The most recent was a guy's mouth. It was a cartoon about censorship, and a guy's mouth was stitched closed, and each of the stitches was a swastika.
Oh, I see.
Or it'll just be on the bottom of the cartoon in different places.
So do you think he's trying to make a radical statement in utilizing it, or does he use it as a decorative element?
You can ask him. He's back there.
I'm not the artist in question. I'm just the editor of the paper. But I told the staff kind of when this became an issue that ultimately I believe in the policy that there's individual responsibility and that each person will be ultimately responsible for censoring his own work. And that I basically decided that if, you know, it comes down to a real obscene situation on the paper, I would stand behind that person's irresponsibility if I had to. And it is, I think, kind of a risky stand, but I felt it was really important.
Well, that's the risk you're taking in publishing it. Do you think that you, as the publisher or the editor, have a responsibility to receive the dialogue of the readers, or
Oh,
the response of the readers?
Absolutely. Delia wrote a letter. And
you published it?
Yeah, we published it. We publish everything.
Yeah.
The sticky thing is that defending someone's irresponsibility only extends to the people on the staff. I can't defend the irresponsibility of everyone. You know, we do have policies as far as letters go. We can't print obscene letters and things like that. But as a member of the staff, they have certain rights and certain responsibilities and certain privileges, as far as I understand it as editor. And I ultimately made the policy. So.
Yes.
Go Delia.
Another objection, to what Josh was saying, he's defending the irresponsibility of whoever's putting it in the paper. But one thing is that it's a public school, and it is the school's paper, and it, in essence, I think in the community, it does represent to the community what the school is. And that in putting out the swastika, it is, in essence, supporting the views represented by the swastika.
I just have a couple of quick comments. I suspect that the editor of the paper is not defending the individual's irresponsibility so much as that individual's right to be irresponsible, which is very different from defending the work itself. That's really not your job to defend the work, and I don't think that that's what you ever planned on doing. There is a twist to this issue, and that is the Supreme Court has determined, I think unfortunately, that high school newspapers are speaking for the institution, and therefore schools have the ultimate editorial right to that newspaper. In fact, if the administration didn't want the swastikas, they wouldn't be there, whether you wanted them or the writer wanted them. It doesn't really make any difference. The school has the ultimate responsibility for that. So this is a little different twist, and we are dealing with an institutional voice. Again, I wish that weren't so.
In addition to just being an institution, I'm talking about the students' voice, too, that go, I mean, as you guys were talking about community dialogue, I think that's an important factor.
I think the response has been absolutely perfect at Hellgate. The letters have been intelligently written. They've been copious. They've attacked the work itself rather than the right to publish that work. I think there's a lot of smart kids at Hellgate. I would do exactly the same thing if I were involved with the issue. Anybody?
I'd just chime in with you there. I think, what is a school supposed to be for? I'd like to ask first off. You're supposed to learn something. You put something in the paper like that, I know it'd grab my eye, and I'm not particularly a supporter of Hitler or swastikas. You know, it goes against every bit of sense that I have in my being, but to, you know, and actually the description that you put forth of a particular cartoon with somebody's mouth sewed shut with swastikas doesn't even, and to me that is sort of a statement against the fascistic tendency that might be represented by a swastika. But to get back to the central point, what has happened is you have generated a spark. Somebody has seen that, it's gotten them riled up, they've thought about it, you get intelligent response letters, the thing is aired out. I don't see where anybody's really been hurt by it, at least nobody's put forth any facts that would tend to show that some, you know, incitement to riot or anything has immediately followed on the heels of the publication of this. So, you know, wherein does wherein does the evil lie is my question. The point of school is education. I think it sounds like it certainly spurred a lot of thought. I would have to, and of course it is within the confines of the court's doctrine regarding school papers, but which I don't agree with either. But taking that out of it, to me, it seems like a perfectly legitimate exercise.
Okay, well, in answer to your question as in to wherein does the evil lie, it has hurt many people at Hellgate. We have, my best friend is a Native American girl, and the violent white supremacist views put out by the swastika that we are faced with every time we open our school newspaper. It's like you can't even enjoy the newspaper often because you see that every time you go in there. I'm Jewish. I lost many cousins in the Holocaust. And just many other students I know are just completely offended by all the painful, the violence, the intolerance, genocide, male dominance, white supremacy, on and on, all these horrible things that the swastika represents. They are a personal affront to us, and they do hurt us in that way by seeing it every day in our school newspaper by fellow students.
Okay, I'd like to, if I might, just make one response that I don't want you to think that I'm an insensitive person because I'm going to say this. But when I open the newspaper, or the Missoulian or whatever it may be, I read stuff in there that hurts me all the time. I mean, I think part of the news is just you're going to get hurt when you read it, for whatever the reason might be. I don't like a lot of the stuff I read in the newspaper. I don't like a lot of the stuff I see on television. It hurts me. But on the other hand, if one insulates oneself from exposure to those things that are very real in this world, and believe me, that it's alive out there. If you want to insulate yourself from that so you don't have to think about it, it's going to continue. It's going to sit out there and fester, whether you want to think about it or not. And whether or not, and perhaps running away from it in a sense by not having to think about it could ultimately turn out to be worse in the long run, because you wouldn't be aware of what was going on. You wouldn't do anything about it. You wouldn't be tuned to the fact that this danger is out there.
Okay, well, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm speaking for a large group of my friends that believe the same way as I do, we're not talking about, we don't want to have to think about it. We don't want to be hidden from it. But it's a forum in our school. It represents our school, I believe. I don't think it's just the staff's paper. And as I know, most of the staff members don't want it on there. A good friend of mine who is the editorials editor didn't want it on her page, but was forced to have it on her page. And this is where our views are being ignored. This is where it's not coming to a point where we want to hide from it, but we don't want it thrown in our face every day, just like we don't want to have to be forced to pray. We don't want to have to be forced to see a swastika every day when it brings out these feelings in us. We're not trying to hide from it, but there's no point in, stabbing again and again, whatever analogy you might use. It's just a pointless act of pain.
I just think it might be kind of important to clarify something. As far as the artwork goes, the artist tries to make the swastika part of the artwork, usually in the case like it's about censorship and it's obviously, taking an opposing view to what a swastika might represent. But also, in the case of the swastika, it's also a kind of almost part of his signature in a way, that he puts a little swastika in there, and it's also kind of become a joke among a lot of people to find the swastika in the cartoon every issue when it comes out. And I guess I just don't think that the swastika is the prevailing message in every cartoon. It may be in the cartoon somewhere, and it may be part of the signature or part of the person's personality in that cartoon, but it is not the prevailing message in every cartoon.
Josh is the artist here.
Yeah, I don't think he wants to speak then.
Let's not identify him.
Oh, all right. Thought it would be nice to have the views of the artist.
It would be.
Well, I don't know. It becomes a judgment call. I think that the dialogue should be, fueled to go as far as it possibly can, you know, on your pages. You know, I guess, see, I just think that there's a point where it becomes opinion. My personal opinion is, I think that there's a point where, you know, the artist should maybe consider some sensitivity in terms of that shade where it goes into joking, that shade of humor where, you know, that's maybe an issue of sensitivity. You know, maybe, okay. But, you know, I just think playing out the dialogue is the important part, and I think that that aspect of what you're both involved in is really valuable.
Oh, I don't think this has all been bad, actually. We had quite a lively discussion in my English class, and I'd also, I think that it's brought people more, you know, realize that things like the NEA and 2 Live Crew in Florida and different issues like that affect their lives personally. I know it's been quite a shock to me, having to defend something that I've been so easy to speak about really easily.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
Just another point of view on the swastika. Recently, there was an exhibition at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. of an artist whose name I unfortunately cannot remember, but the images that he's known for making are these sort of large silhouette things. He has one of a windmill, and it's all red, and one of a windmill that's all black, you know, and they're huge. But he also had this phase in time when he was experimenting with rooms, interior kind of structures. And in one of these interior structures, he had a swastika symbol. And on the wall next to this piece of art, the museum had written this disclaimer or explanation, and that is that the swastika as a symbol is ancient, and it was appropriated by the Nazis, but that is not what the artist had intended with this particular image in this particular piece, and so therefore they hoped that the public would not be offended. Now, and my reaction was that in a way, well, that's nice. That's education, right? That's what I'm for. Okay, that's education. On the other hand, I'm thinking it's really pretty horrific to me that we have to have disclaimers next to our art, but if that's what we have to have the art there, I guess it's okay. But you might question this person about his knowledge of how far the swastika goes. And is he intending it as a Nazi symbol? Does he like its formal qualities? You know, what does he really feel about that? Okay.
I'd like to point out that rather proudly, at least I feel some pride, that Studio One in Missoula closed without any public ordinances. People just didn't go. And I think public pressure can maybe change somebody's mind about swastikas. And in the meantime, people at Hellgate High School are talking about the Holocaust. I haven't heard that in years. So maybe we can use an unfortunate turn of events to some benefit. And I certainly hope so. And I hope that peer pressure eventually works.
That's what we're asking.
Yeah. Gotcha. Is there another question? Have you been waiting? You're a patient man.
My name is Lane Great, and I'm a freelance writer, and I wanted to get back to the issue as a whole here. And I was noticing that there seems to be kind of a sense of compromise going on here with our moderator story about the painting and some of Ms. Boussard's comments about the NEA grants and some of the compromises on that. And if I understand you correctly, suggesting maybe even that an artist has an obligation to try not to offend people, and some of these ideas of compromise that are going on. And I'd like to ask where that leaves us with the idea of there shall be no law abridging the freedom of speech, flat out, no law. And where does that leave us in relationship to that? When we've lost that flat no law, where does that leave us in the face of people like Jesse Helms?
Leaves us in a fairly poor position. But again, I have to go back to, if you want freedom of speech, you have to stand up for it. Absolutely and irrevocably, we have to stand up for it. And in this country, in this period of time, in the last several years, Nobody's been standing up. That's it. When nobody's standing up and the other side is standing up, they get to win. It's a vote call. You know, that's what this country is all about. If there are 10 votes on this side and 2 votes on this side, the 10 on that side get to win. It becomes that simple, and it isn't that simple. It's extremely complex issues, but we have to try to break it down to be that simple. If you feel you've done your part, if everybody else feels they've done their part, then good triumphs over bad. The right shall win out, whatever you want to call it. But those people are working very hard, extremely hard. They have office buildings in Washington for the last 5 years. They've been waiting for this. They've sent people out saying, go look at the NEA, watch it, look for it, check out every artist, and when you find one that looks like they're doing something weird, you come back and tell us, and we'll go for it. And then they amass thousands and thousands of dollars through the mail from all kinds of people who are living in fear because they don't understand, and they don't want bad things to happen to them, and they don't want bad things to happen to their children. And so they think, gosh, we better, send in our $10. They send out $10. In the meantime, all the rest of the artists are out hanging out in some other place, not paying any attention to anything. And certainly through my involvement there and the phone calls that I called a major arts organization in this country, and I said, in Montana, we would like to begin to do some ads. We would like to do some pro-NEA ads. We'd like to do some ads that would defend what Pat Williams is trying to do. We'd like to bomb the towns in terms of getting the ads out, all at the same time, and having a certain amount of statistical sort of way of doing it in an organized manner. Laura and I spent months on this. Is there any money? No. There's no money from any national arts organizations. First of all, most of them don't have much. And if they do, they're too disorganized to even put it together to give us any. There was a tape made by Jessica Tandy that stood up. She did a PSA that came out and said, if driving Miss Daisy would never have gotten out of the garage if it hadn't been for the NEA. Well, that was the most she ever said. I mean, she's very soft-spoken and sophisticated and quiet and so on. And it was a lovely thing, but you had to really know what was going on to look at the tape and understand the issue behind it. And Carol O'Connor made a PSA and so on. So when I called this organization, I said, send me some tapes so that I can get them down to the stations and see if I could try to run in Montana.
I think it's pretty important for anybody in a position of public trust, such as I am, for example, or a teacher, to take a proactive stance in favor of intellectual freedom. I mean, you can't sit around and wait for someone to come in your library and decide that they want to remove 100 books on some subject. You have to be out there letting people know that you favor diversity of views and opinions. And I think that applies, that same kind of thing applies to artists also. And the initiative is with people who do want to censor and people who have targeted not only artists but schools and libraries also in an organized way. And that's, you can sit around bemoaning that, or you can take a proactive stance, and I think you have to take a proactive stance.
And I guess this is exactly my point, and if I understand Ms. Millin, is it correctly, that sometimes even when we have the right to say something, maybe we shouldn't in the sake of good taste, and I guess my idea here is that when we accept any compromise on free speech, any compromise whatsoever, haven't we lost something? Haven't we lost something from what the Founding Fathers intended?
I really didn't mean to advocate silence or compromise. I intended to advocate an open ear to different viewpoints, because I think that art is basically, when it's really good, it's very provocative. And you have to be open to get the response back from it, and that's the main issue point I was trying to make. No, I think that, for instance, one of the things that's been discouraging to me that I alluded to is that John Frohmeyer, who's currently the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, went along with the National Council in vetoing 4 artists' fellowships, which had been approved by peer panel review, and turned them down from being funded based on what they were anticipating might be the objectionable content of their art. And that became a very confusing thing, you know, that here we are trying to defend the National Endowment, make sure that it's reauthorized without restrictions, and Dana and I really have killed ourselves to represent Montana with that position. And then the NEA makes this move. That happened in June. And you know, so it's very complicated. And I think that when you look at these issues, they become very complicated. You're suddenly not just looking at the issue of censorship, but you're looking at racism. You're looking at, you know, the politics, the political process. As Mr. Scott was saying, you know, and together with what Dana was saying, our legislators are ignorant of what the NEA, how the NEA actually works, and what the NEA actually is. And yet they're the ones casting the votes that are going to make this decision. And as Mr. Scott was saying, they're basing that decision on the barometer reading of their voters, you know. So it becomes very complicated. And I think we do have to hold the line, but I think it's complicated.
Okay, well, maybe I should have started with back to the very initial, the very basics, is there ever a time when there is something that shouldn't be said, anything that we don't have the right to say?
I'd just like to, I think that anyone who is prepared to accept a little bit of First Amendment rights is dead wrong. The minute one compromises on the First Amendment, one opens the door to fascism. And I think there's no question about it. And if you look around the world and if you understand history, that's always the case. So whether an individual should be introspective and choose carefully what he or she wants to say is one question. But there's never a question as to whether or not they have the right to say it.
Right.
That's not a question.
Yeah.
But does the public have the right to respond, is the point.
They're obligated
The point I'm
to.
saying is yes, they do.
Absolutely, they do have a right to respond.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Other questions from the floor? Comments? Anyone like to sum up?
I'd like to say one thing.
Sure.
It seems to me that one problem that what you might call the left or those who have historically been in favor of protecting the Bill of Rights and free speech in particular, that I see is this tremendous sense of ennui, malaise. There's nothing I can do, why bother? It all sort of started to die out when Vietnam was over. There was no longer any galvanizing force for people who were interested in preserving individual rights and so forth. And so for the past 15 years, the right wing, which I'm using in this sense to be those opposed to freedom of speech or that want to inject their particular moral stance into the laws of this country, have been working away. They've been doing it for a long time. They're very well organized. They're out there. And so what we've got is a situation where you have a large group of cohesively organized people who are working very hard with the fervor, religious fervor, it's the only way to explain it, towards what their view of a proper and moral society should be. And you've got this disarray of individual forces who are sort of thinking, well, gee, I don't know, what could I do anyway? I mean, there isn't much you can do, is there? And so you get this and it's been this way for quite a few years now. But there is something you can do. I guess want to end on maybe a note of optimism in terms of the legislative function. That I felt the same way for a long time. And I just happened to be in a position at a time when I did some things that, and I was amazed how much power one person can exert, especially in a state like Montana. I don't pretend to know how you would go about it on the national level, but maybe everything starts closer to home anyway. And there's a tremendous battle going on right now up in Lincoln County. The county commissioners up there tried to put through a law establishing censorship vis-a-vis sexual matters. And a couple of people up there were extremely nauseated by this situation. They went out, stood around some of the mills up there, collected petition signatures, got enough petitions to get that thing on the ballot. It's on the ballot right now. And in the meanwhile, the thing is not being enforced because there's a provision in the law which states that once it's set to go on the ballot, it's stayed from enforcement. So they've at least put it off for a few months and stand a darn good chance of stopping that particular censorship law done by the fiat of their county commissioners right there. I mean, that's a local issue. In the state, it's intimidating when you go up there to that great big marble capitol and you see all these people in suits and their little thing, and you don't know what the heck you're doing, and you're just going, oh. But honestly, a call, a letter, personal, anything to your legislator, to any of the legislators, that shows that you're watching, you know what's going on, and that expresses your voice in terms of, it's sort of the ultimate freedom of speech. That we're watching you, and there are people out here that are opposed to this type of legislation. That does, it's really amazing how much you can do. All the way, and I can speak all the way up to the state level. I can't speak to the federal level. So I'd like to say that, kind of in summation of my feeling on the thing is that you can't, nothing is going to improve until people start to take responsibility for what they believe in. And it's as easy as making a phone call and as cheap as making a phone call. And you can do more than that if you want, but it really only takes a couple hundred phone calls from a state with 800,000 people, that isn't a very large percentage, to have a huge impact on a legislator. This is something I learned when I was up there, and I'd keep it in mind.
I concur.
Okay.
I think we'd be better off if the dialogue was just a lot richer, a lot more active, a lot more verbal, a lot more controversial.
Yes.
I don't want to say this on TV, so we're not on TV, is that right?
We are on TV, yes, we are.
Still are?
Yes.
Well, I'll say it anyway.
Good. Would you like to use the microphone? You don't have to, but we'd prefer it.
Well, I'm a writer, and I'm one of those basically unpublished kinds, and those are really the only free ones, the ones that aren't trying, to please the publisher or whatever. And I think that the only art, I think art has to be completely, totally free, and I think the only art that's free is the art that doesn't take anything from anybody, and that would include the NEA. And, I realize this from my upbringing. I've taken money from my parents. Whenever you take money from somebody, you get a lot of flack.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Well, I need to respond to Bob and close with a pitch, and that is there have been over the past 10 or 12 years in Missoula a lot of people kicking and scratching to put together a First Amendment forum for the people of Missoula, and it opened on Earth Day, April 22nd of this year. MCAT, $250,000 worth of equipment, a professional paid staff to train the citizens in its use, free use of the equipment, and a dedicated channel on which your voice will be aired.